Before we dive into one of the most brutal and defining chapters of the American Revolution, I want to ask you to do me a favor. If you find value in these stories, if you appreciate the effort that goes into bringing you the real, unvarnished history of how this nation was forged, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue doing this work, and it lets me know that you want more of this content. Now, let's get into a story that most Americans have never heard. The story of how the South nearly lost everything, how slavery became a weapon of war, and how ordinary men and women endured horrors that would break most people today. To understand what happened in the Southern campaign, we need to trace events carefully, because this is where the war nearly ended in disaster for the American cause. Lord George Germain, sitting comfortably in his office in London, prepared the plan for the Southern campaign of 1778 with great minuteness of detail. Georgia and South Carolina were to be reduced by detachments from the army in New York and held by the employment of their own militia. The upland settlements were to be separated from the planters of the Low Country. One group was to be reduced by the terror of savage warfare, the other by the fear of their slaves. The city of Charleston was in due time to be taken. On the appearance of a small corps at Cape Fear, it was thought that large numbers of inhabitants would doubtless flock to the standard of the king, whose government would be restored in North Carolina. But for want of troops, the summer at the South passed away in idleness. When autumn came, 2 expeditions of regulars and vindictive refugees were sent by Brigadier General Prevost from East Florida into Georgia. One was stopped at Sunbury, the other at the Ogeechee. The latter, on its return, burned the church, almost every dwelling house in Midway, and all rice and other cereals within their reach. They brought off Negroes, horses, cattle, and plate. Screven, an American officer beloved for his virtues, was killed after he became a prisoner. Robert Howe, the American commander in the Southern District, returned from an expedition against St. Augustine after the loss of 1/4 of his men. In December, 3,000 men dispatched from New York under Lieutenant Colonel Campbell approached Savannah. Relying on the difficulties of the ground, Howe offered resistance to a disciplined corps ably commanded and more than 3 times as numerous as his own. But on the 29th of December, a British party guided by a Negro through a swamp made a simultaneous attack on the Americans in front and rear and drove them into precipitate retreat. With a loss of but 24 killed and wounded, the British gained the capital of Georgia and more than 400 prisoners. Campbell promised protection to the inhabitants, but only on condition that they would support the royal government with their arms. The captive soldiers, refusing to enlist in the British service, were crowded on board prison ships to be swept away by infection. Many civilians submitted. Determined Republicans found an asylum in the western parts of the state. At the request of the delegates from South Carolina, Robert Howe was superseded in the Southern Command by Major General Benjamin Lincoln. In private life, this officer was most estimable. As a soldier, he was brave but slow in perception and in will. Toward the end of 1776, he had repaired to Washington's camp as a major general of militia. In the following February, he was transferred to the Continental Service and passed the winter at Morristown. In the spring of 1777, he was surprised by the British and narrowly escaped. In the summer, he was sent to the north, but never took part in any battle. Wounded by a British party whom he mistook for Americans, left the camp, having been in active service less than a year. He had not fully recovered when on the 4th of December 1778 he entered upon the command in Charleston. Early in January 1779, Prevost marched to Savannah, reducing Sunbury on the way, and Campbell took possession of Augusta. The province of Georgia appearing to be restored to the crown, plunder became the chief thought of the British army.
Lincoln took post near Perrysburg with at first scarcely more than 1,100 men. The British detached 200 men to Beaufort. Moultrie, sent almost alone to counteract the movement, rallied under his standard about an equal number of militia and 9 Continentals. Their enemy had the advantage of position, but under a leader they trusted, on the 3rd of February, they drove the invaders with great loss to their ships.
The Continental regiments of North Carolina were with Washington. Its legislature promptly sent, under Ashe and Rutherford, 2,000 men, though without arms, to serve for 5 months. The scanty stores of South Carolina were exhausted in arming them. In the last days of January 1779, they joined the camp of Lincoln. The Assembly of South Carolina, superseding Rawlins Lowndes by an almost unanimous vote, recalled John Rutledge to be their governor, ordered a regiment of light dragoons to be raised, offered a bounty of $500 to every one who would enlist for 16 months, and gave power to the governor and council to draft the militia of the state and do everything necessary for the public good. The British, having carried their arms into the upper country of Georgia, sent emissaries to encourage a rising in South Carolina. A party of men, whose chief object was rapine, put themselves in motion to join the British, gathering booty on the way. They were pursued across the Savannah by Colonel Andrew Pickens with about 300 of the citizens of 96. On the 14th of February, they were overtaken, surprised, and routed. About 200 escaped to the British lines. Their commander and 40 others fell in battle, and many prisoners were taken. The Republican government, which since 1776 had maintained its jurisdiction without dispute in every part of the Commonwealth, arraigned some of them in the civil court. By a jury of their fellow citizens, 70 of them were convicted of treason and rebellion against the state of South Carolina. Of these, 5 were executed. The army of Lincoln was greatly inferior to the British in number and far more so in quality, yet he detached Ashe with 1,500 of the North Carolina militia on separate service. This inexperienced general crossed the Savannah at Augusta, which the British had abandoned, descended the river with the view to confine the enemy within narrower limits, and, following his orders, encamped his party at Briar Creek on the Savannah beyond supporting distance. The post seemed to him strong, as it had but one approach. The British amused Lincoln by a feint, while Lieutenant Colonel Prevost turned the position of Ashe, and on the 3rd day of March fell upon his party. The few Continentals, about 60 in number, alone made a brave defense. By wading through swamps and swimming the Savannah, 450 of the militia rejoined the American camp. The rest perished, or were captured or returned to their homes. So quickly was 1/4 of the troops of Lincoln lost. After this success, General Prevost proclaimed a sort of civil government in Georgia. Reinforced from the South Carolina militia, of whom Rutledge had assembled great numbers at Orangeburg, Lincoln undertook to lead his troops against Savannah by way of Augusta, leaving only 1,000 militia under Moultrie at Perrysburg. Prevost had the choice between awaiting an attack or invading the richest part of Carolina. His decision was for the side which promised booty. On the 28th of April, supported by Indians, he crossed the river with 3,000 men and drove Moultrie before him. It was represented to him that Charleston was defenseless. After 2 or 3 days of doubt, the hope of seizing the city lured him on, and upon the 11th of May he appeared before the town. He came 2 days too late. While he hesitated, the men of Charleston had protected the neck by sudden but well-planned works. On the 9th and 10th, Rutledge arrived with militia, and Moultrie with all of his party that remained true to him, as well as a detachment of 300 men from the army of Lincoln. While the British crossed the Ashley River, Pulaski and a corps were ferried over the Cooper into Charleston. In the camp of Washington, young Lawrence became impatient to fly to his native state and levy and command a regiment of blacks.
Alexander Hamilton recommended the project to the President of Congress in these words: "The Negroes will make very excellent soldiers. This project will have to combat prejudice and self-interest. Contempt for the blacks makes us fancy many things that are founded neither in reason nor experience. Their natural faculties are as good as ours. Give them their freedom with their muskets. This will secure their fidelity, animate their courage, and have a good influence upon those who remain by opening the door for their emancipation. Humanity and true policy equally interest me in favor of this unfortunate class of men."
2 days later, the elder Laurens wrote to Washington, "Had we arms for 3,000 such black men as I could select in Carolina, I should have no doubt of driving the British out of Georgia and subduing East Florida before the end of July." To this, Washington answered, "Should we begin to form battalions of them, I have not the smallest doubt the British would follow us in it and justify the measure upon our own ground. The contest, then, must be who can arm fastest, and where are our arms." Congress listened to Huger, the agent from South Carolina, as he explained that his state was weak because many of its citizens must remain at home to prevent revolts among the Negroes or their desertion to the enemy. It recommended as a remedy that the 2 southernmost of the 13 states should arm 3,000 of the most vigorous and enterprising of the Negroes under command of white officers. A few days before the British came near Charleston, young Laurens arrived bringing this advice of Congress. It was heard in anger and rejected. The state felt itself cast off and alone. Georgia had fallen. The country between Savannah and Charleston was overrun. The British confiscated all Negroes whom they could seize. Their emissaries were urging the rest to rise against their owners or to run away. Many began to regret the struggle for independence. Moved by their dread of exposing Charleston to be taken by storm, and sure at least of gaining time by protracted parleys, the executive government sent a flag to ask of the invaders their terms for a capitulation. In answer, the British general offered peace to the inhabitants who would accept protection, to all others the condition of prisoners of war. The council at its next meeting debated giving up the town. Moultrie, Laurens, and Pulaski, who were called in, declared that they had men enough to beat the invaders, and yet, against the voice of Gadsden, of Ferguson, of John Edwards, and of others, the majority, irritated by the advice of Congress to emancipate and arm slaves, proposed a neutrality during the war. The question whether the state shall belong to Great Britain or remain one of the United States to be determined by the treaty of peace between the 2 powers. Laurens, being called upon to bear this message, scornfully refused, and another was selected. The British general declined to treat with the civil government of South Carolina, but made answer to Moultrie that the garrison must surrender as prisoners of war. "Then we will fight it out," said Moultrie to the governor and council, and left their tent. Gadsden and Ferguson followed him to say, "Act according to your own judgment, and we will support you." Moultrie waved the flag from the gate as a signal that the conference was at an end. The enemy had intercepted a letter from Lincoln in which he charged Moultrie not to give up the city nor suffer the people to despair, for he was hastening to their relief. At daylight the next morning the British were gone. They had escaped an encounter by retreating to the islands. The Americans, for want of boats, could not prevent their embarkation nor their establishing a post at Beaufort. The Carolina militia returned home. Lincoln, who was left with but about 800 men, passed the great heats of summer at Sheldon. The invasion of South Carolina by the army of General Prevost proved nothing more than a raid through the richest plantations of the state. The British pillaged almost every house in a wide extent of country, sparing in some measure those who professed loyalty to the king. Objects of value not transportable were destroyed. Porcelain, mirrors, windows were dashed in pieces. Gardens carefully planted with exotics were laid waste. Domestic animals were wantonly shot. About 3,000 fugitive slaves passed with the army into Georgia. The southernmost states looked for relief to the French fleet in America, but ill fortune clung to it. In September 1778, the Marquis de Bouillé, the gallant Governor-General of the French Windward Islands, in a single day wrested from Great Britain the strongly fortified island of Dominica. But D'Estaing, with a greatly increased fleet and a land force of 9,000 men, came in sight of the island of St. Lucia just as its last French flag had been struck to a corps of 1,500 British troops. A landing for its recovery was repulsed, with a loss to D'Estaing of nearly 1,500 men. Early in January 1779, reinforcements under Admiral Byron transferred maritime superiority to the British, and D'Estaing for 6 months sheltered his fleet within the Bay of Port Royal. At the end of June, Byron, having left St. Lucia to convoy a company of British merchant ships through the passages, D'Estaing detached a force against St. Vincent, which, with the aid of the oppressed and enslaved Caribs, its native inhabitants, was easily taken. This is the only instance in the war where insurgent slaves acted efficiently. On the 4th of July, Grenada surrendered at discretion to the French admiral. 2 days later, the fleet of Byron arrived within sight of the French and, though reduced in number, sought a general action, which the French knew how to avoid. In the running fight that ensued, the British ships suffered so much in their masts and rigging that the French recovered the superiority. To a direct cooperation with the United States, D'Estaing was drawn by the wish of Congress, the entreaties of South Carolina, and his own never-failing goodwill. On the first day of September, he approached Georgia so suddenly that he took by surprise 4 British ships of war. To the government of South Carolina, he announced his readiness to assist in reducing Savannah, but he made it a condition that his fleet, which consisted of 33 sail, should not be detained long off so dangerous a coast. In 10 days, the French troops, though unassisted, effected their landing. Meantime, the British commander worked day and night with relays of hundreds of Negroes to strengthen his defenses. On the 16th, D'Estaing summoned General Prevost to surrender. While Prevost gained time by a triple interchange of notes, Maitland, regardless of malaria, pressed through the swamps of the Low Country and, flushed with a mortal fever caught on the march, brought to his aid 800 men from Beaufort. When they all had arrived, the British gave their answer of defiance. It was the 23rd of September when the Americans, under Lincoln, joined the French in the siege of Savannah. On the 8th of October, the reduction of Savannah seemed still so far distant that the naval officers insisted on the rashness of leaving the fleet longer exposed to autumnal gales or to an attack with so much of its strength on land. A landing for its recovery was resolved on for the next day, an hour before sunrise, by 2 feigned and 2 real attacks. The only chance of success lay in the precise execution of the plan. The column under Count Dillon, which was to have attacked the rear of the British lines, missed its way in a swamp of which it should have only skirted the edge, was helplessly exposed to the British batteries, and could not even be formed. It was broad day when the party with D'Estaing, accompanied by a part of the Carolinians, advanced fearlessly, but only to become huddled together near the parapet under a destructive fire from musketry and cannon. The American standard was planted on the ramparts by Hume and by Bush, lieutenants of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment, but both of them fell. At their side, Sergeant Jasper was mortally wounded, but he used his last moments of his life to bring off the colors which he supported. A French standard was planted with no better result.
After an obstinate struggle of 55 minutes to carry the redoubt, the assailants retreated before a charge of grenadiers and marines led gallantly by Maitland. The injury sustained by the British was trifling. The loss of the Americans was about 200. Of the French, thrice as many. D'Estaing was twice wounded, Pulaski once and mortally. The cries of the dying, so wrote the severely wounded Baron d'Estedinck to his king, Gustavus III of Sweden, pierced me to the heart. I desired death and might have found it, but for the necessity of thinking how to save 400 men whose retreat was stopped by a broken bridge. The Patriots of Georgia who had joined in the siege fled to the backwoods or across the river. The French sailed for France. At Paris, Stedink, as he moved about on crutches, became the delight of the highest social circle, and at one of the theaters was personated on the stage, leading a storming party. Lincoln repaired to Charleston and was followed by what remained of his army. The militia of South Carolina returned home. Its Continental regiments were melting away. Its paper money became so nearly worthless that a bounty of $2,500 for 21 months' service had no attraction. The dwellers near the sea between Charleston and Savannah knew not where to find protection. Throughout the state, the people were disheartened and foreboded its desolation. Now that the British held Georgia and Beaufort in South Carolina, they might have gained an enduring mastery by emancipating and arming the blacks. But the idea that slavery was a sin against humanity was unknown to Parliament and to the ministry, and would have been hooted at by the army. The thought of universal emancipation had not yet conquered the convictions of the ruling class in England. The English of that day rioted in the lucrative slave trade, and the zeal of the government in upholding it had been one of the causes that provoked the American War. The advice to organize an army of liberated Negroes, though persisted in by the royal governor of Virginia, was crushed by the eagerness of the British officers and soldiers in America for plunder. In this, they were encouraged by the cordial approbation of the king and his ministers. The instructions from Germain authorized the confiscation and sale not only of Negroes employed in the American army, but of those who voluntarily followed the British troops and took sanctuary under British jurisdiction. They continued to be shipped to the slave markets of the West Indies. Before the end of 3 months after the capture of Savannah, all the property, real and personal, of the rebels in Georgia was disposed of. For further gains, Indians were encouraged to bring in slaves wherever they could find them. All families in South Carolina were subjected to the visits of successive sets of banditti who received commissions as volunteers with no pay or emolument but that derived from rapine, and who, roaming about at pleasure, robbed the plantations alike of patriots and loyalists. Negroes were the spoil most coveted. On the average, they were valued at $250 silver each. When Sir James Wright returned to the government of Georgia, he found several thousands of them awaiting distribution among claimants. Every hope of the slave for enfranchisement was crushed. The property of the greatest part of the inhabitants of South Carolina was confiscated. Families divided, patriots outlawed and savagely assassinated, houses burned, and women and children driven shelterless into the forests. Districts so desolated that they seemed the abode only of orphans and widows. Left mainly to her own resources, it was through the depths of wretchedness that her sons were to bring her back to her place in the Republic, after suffering more and daring more and achieving more than the men of any other state. Sir Henry Clinton, who had so completely failed before Charleston in 1776, resolved in person to carry out the order for its reduction. In August, an English fleet commanded by Arbuthnot, an old and inefficient admiral, brought him reinforcements and stores. In September, 1,500 men arrived from Ireland. In October, the troops which had so long been stationed in Rhode Island joined his army. He still waited till he became assured that the superior fleet of D'Estaing had sailed for Europe.
Leaving the command in New York to the veteran Knyphausen, Clinton, with 8,500 officers and men on the day after Christmas 1779, set sail for the conquest of South Carolina. The admiral led the van into the adverse current of the Gulf Stream. Glacial storms scattered the fleet. An ordnance vessel foundered. American privateers captured some of the transports. A bark carrying Hessian troops lost its masts, was driven by gales across the ocean, and broke in pieces just after its famished passengers landed near St. Ives in England. Most of the horses perished. Few of the transports arrived at Tybee in Georgia, the place of rendezvous, before the end of January. Clinton immediately ordered from New York Lord Rawdon's brigade of about 3,000 more. Charleston was an opulent town of 15,000 inhabitants, free and slave. Among them were traders and others who were the representatives of British interests. The city, which was not deserted by its private families, had no great store of provisions. The paper money of the province was worth but 5% of its nominal value. The town, like the country around it, was flat and low. On 3 sides it lay upon the water. For its complete investment, an enemy who commanded the sea needed only to occupy the neck between the Cooper and the Ashley rivers. It had neither citadel nor fort, nor ramparts, nor materials for building anything more than field works of loose sand kept together by boards and logs. The ground to be defended within the limits of the city was very extensive, and Lincoln commanded less than 2,000 effective men. On the 3rd of February, 1780, the General Assembly of South Carolina entrusted the executive of the state with power to do all things necessary to secure its liberty, safety, and happiness, except taking the life of a citizen without legal trial. But the defeat before Savannah had disheartened the people. The southern part of the state needed all its men for its own protection. The middle part was disaffected. The frontiers were menaced by savage tribes. Yet, without taking counsel of his officers, Lincoln, reluctant to abandon public property which he had not means to transport, remained in the city. On the 26th, the British forces from the eastern side of St. John's Island gained a view of the town, its harbor, the sea, and carefully cultivated plantations, which, after their fatigues, seemed to them a paradise. The best defense of the harbor was the bar at its outlet. Already on the 27th, the officers of the Continental Squadron, which carried 150 guns, reported their inability to guard it. Then, in the opinion of Washington, the attempt to defend the town ought to have been relinquished. But Lincoln, intent only on strengthening its fortifications, was the first to go to work on them in the morning and would not return till late in the evening. With the guns of the squadron and its seamen, he manned batteries on shore, and ships were sunk to close the entrance to the Ashley River. Clinton, trusting nothing to hazard, moved slowly along a coast intersected by creeks and checkered with islands. Lincoln used the time to draw into Charleston all the force in the southern department of which he could dispose. On the 7th of April, the remains of the Virginia line, 700 veterans, entered Charleston, having in 28 days marched 500 miles to certain captivity. On the 9th, Arbuthnot, taking advantage of a gentle east wind, brought his ships into the harbor without suffering from Fort Moultrie or returning its fire. The next day, the first parallel being completed, Clinton and Arbuthnot summoned the town to surrender. Lincoln answered, "From duty and inclination, I shall support the town to the last extremity."
On the 13th, the American officers insisted that Governor Rutledge should withdraw from Charleston, leaving Gadsden, the lieutenant governor, with 5 of the council. On the same morning, Lincoln, for the first time, called a council of war and suggested an evacuation. "We should not lose an hour," said McIntosh, "in attempting to get the Continental troops over the Cooper River, for on their safety depends the salvation of the state." But Lincoln only invited them to consider the measure maturely till he should send for them again. Before he called a second council, the American cavalry, which kept up some connection between the town and the country, had been surprised and dispersed. Cornwallis had arrived with nearly 3,000 men from New York. The British had occupied the peninsula from the Cooper to the Wando, so that an evacuation was no longer possible. On the 6th of May, Fort Moultrie surrendered without firing a gun. On the 12th, when the British were ready to assault the town by land and water, Lincoln signed a capitulation. The Continental troops and sailors became prisoners of war until exchanged. The militia from the country were to return home as prisoners of war on parole and to be secure in their property so long as their parole should be observed.
All free male adults in Charleston, including the aged, the infirm, and even the Loyalists, were counted and paroled as prisoners, of whom Clinton, in this vainglorious way, raised the number to 5,000. The value of the spoil, which was distributed by English and Hessian commissaries of captures, amounted to about £300,000 sterling. The dividend of a major general exceeded 4,000 guineas. There was no restraint on private rapine. The silver plate of the planters was carried off. All Negroes that had belonged to rebels were seized, even though they had themselves sought an asylum within the British lines. At one embarkation, 2,000 of them were shipped to the West Indies for sale. British and German officers thought more of amassing fortunes than of reuniting the empire. The Patriots were not allowed to appoint attorneys to manage or to sell their estates. A sentence of confiscation hung over the land, and British protection was granted only on the unconditional promise of loyalty. For 6 weeks, all opposition ceased in South Carolina. One expedition was sent by Clinton up the Savannah to encourage the loyal and reduce the disaffected in the neighborhood of Augusta. Another proceeded for the like purpose to the District of 96, where Williamson surrendered his post and accepted British protection. Pickens was reduced to inactivity. Alone of the leaders of the Patriot militia, Colonel James Williams escaped pursuit and preserved his freedom of action. A third and larger party under Cornwallis moved across the Santee toward Camden. The rear of the old Virginia line, commanded by Colonel Beaufort, arriving too late to reinforce the garrison of Charleston, had retreated toward the northeast of the state. They were pursued, and on the 29th of May they were overtaken by Tarleton with 700 cavalry and mounted infantry. Beaufort himself, a few who were mounted, and about 100 of the infantry saved themselves by flight. The rest, making no resistance, vainly sued for quarter. None was granted. 113 were killed on the spot. 150 were too badly hacked to be moved. 53 only could be brought into Camden as prisoners. The tidings of this massacre, borne through the southern forests, excited horror and anger, but Tarleton received from Cornwallis the highest encomiums. The capture of Charleston suspended all resistance to the British army. The men of Beaufort, of 96, and of Camden capitulated under the promise of security, believing that they were to be treated as neutrals or as prisoners on parole. The attempt was now made to force the men of Carolina into active service in the British Army, and so to become the instruments of their own subjection. On the 22nd of May, confiscation of property and other punishments were denounced against all who should thereafter oppose the king in arms or hinder anyone from joining his forces. On the 1st of June, a proclamation by the commissioners Clinton and Arbuthnot offered pardon to the penitent on their immediate return to allegiance. To the loyal, the promise of their former political immunities, including freedom from taxation except by their own legislature.
On the 3rd of June, Clinton, by a proclamation which he alone signed, cut up British authority in Carolina by the roots. He required all the inhabitants of the province, even those outside of Charleston who were now prisoners on parole, to take an active part in securing the royal government. Should they neglect to return to their allegiance, so ran the proclamation, they will be treated as rebels to the government of the king. He never reflected that many who accepted protection from fear or convenience did so in the expectation of living in a state of neutrality, and that they might say, "If we must fight, let us fight on the side of our friends, of our countrymen, of America." On the eve of his departure for New York, he reported to Germain, "The inhabitants from every quarter declare their allegiance to the king and offer their services in arms. There are few men in South Carolina who are not either our prisoners or in arms with us." That was the moment when it seemed the South was lost. But Clinton had made a fatal miscalculation. By forcing men who had accepted British protection to take up arms for the king, he ignited a guerrilla war that would become the most savage, the most brutal chapter of the entire American Revolution. The South would suffer as no other region suffered.
But from that suffering would come a resistance so fierce, so relentless, that it would ultimately doom the British campaign. That story, the story of how ordinary men became partisans, how they fought from the shadows, how they refused to surrender even when everything seemed lost, that's a story for another time. If you want to hear it, make sure you're subscribed, because we're just getting started. Britain would fight on for years, but the strategic advantage had passed to the Americans and their French allies. The commissioners sent by Lord North returned to England humiliated and empty-handed. They had offered everything short of independence: representation in Parliament, freedom from taxation, self-governance. But it was too late. The American people had tasted independence and would accept nothing less. The voice of Congress was indeed the voice of the people, and that voice spoke with one word: independence. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin received the news of the ratification with quiet satisfaction. He had spent months in the salons and ministries of France, patiently building the case for American independence, enduring the doubts of Maurepas, the hesitations of the king, and the skepticism of ministers who wondered if a ragtag collection of rebels could truly stand against the British Empire. Now the alliance was sealed, and French ships and soldiers would soon be crossing the Atlantic. The entry of France into the war transformed everything. Britain now faced not just a colonial rebellion, but a global conflict. Her resources would be stretched thin defending possessions in the Caribbean, Gibraltar, India, and elsewhere. The Royal Navy, which had dominated the seas for generations, would now have to contend with the French fleet. Spain would soon join as well, though carefully avoiding any formal recognition of American independence, lest the example inspire their own vast colonial empire. For King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the decision to support America seemed at the time a masterstroke of foreign policy. They could weaken their ancient rival England, restore French prestige after the humiliations of the 7 Years' War, and demonstrate French power to all of Europe. They could not know that the principles they were helping to establish across the Atlantic, the ideas of popular sovereignty and natural rights, would return to France within a decade and sweep away their world entirely. The philosophers and intellectuals of Paris celebrated. In coffee houses and salons, they toasted American independence as the dawn of a new age. Voltaire had blessed America with the words God and liberty. Rousseau's ideas about the social contract seemed to be taking form in the New World. The American experiment was proof that Enlightenment principles could actually govern real people in the real world, not just in the pages of philosophical treatises. But the war was far from won. Clinton held New York with a powerful force. The British controlled much of the South. Their ships still ruled most of the Atlantic. The American economy was in shambles, the continental currency nearly worthless, the army often unpaid and poorly supplied. State governments bickered with Congress and with each other. Many Americans remained loyal to the crown and fought with determination against their rebel neighbors. Washington understood all of this. As he watched his army settle into new positions along the Hudson River, maintaining watch over New York, he knew that years of hard fighting lay ahead. But something fundamental had changed. America was no longer alone. The greatest military power in Europe had recognized American independence and pledged its support. Ships laden with French supplies were already crossing the ocean. French officers and soldiers would soon join American forces in the field. Most importantly, the French fleet would challenge British control of the seas, making possible operations that would have been unthinkable before. At Valley Forge, during those terrible winter months, when men died of cold and hunger, when disease ravaged the camp and desertions multiplied, it had seemed at times that the cause might simply collapse from sheer physical exhaustion. But the army had endured. Baron von Steuben had drilled them into a professional force. The spring had brought new hope, and now the summer brought the French alliance and victory at Monmouth. The Battle of Monmouth proved something crucial. American soldiers, properly trained and competently led, could stand against British regulars in open battle and drive them from the field. Lee's treachery had nearly cost them the victory, but Washington's leadership had snatched triumph from the jaws of defeat. The army that had been forged in the snows of Valley Forge and tempered in the heat of Monmouth would carry the fight forward. In London, the news from America created consternation. The opposition in Parliament grew bolder. Men who had long argued that the war was unwinnable now found their predictions coming true. The king remained stubborn, determined to bring the rebellious colonies to heel. But even he could see that the situation had deteriorated badly. With France in the war and Spain likely to follow, Britain faced enemies on multiple fronts, with resources already stretched thin. Lord North, that mediocre minister who had stumbled into war and then prosecuted it with such signal incompetence, remained in office only because no one else would take his place on the condition of continuing the war. The best men in Britain refused to have anything to do with the American conflict. They saw it as unjust, unwinnable, and destructive to British liberties at home. But the king's stubbornness and the momentum of policy kept the war grinding forward, consuming lives and treasure for years to come. The story of how America won its independence is not just a story of battles and generals, though those played their part. It is a story of ideas, of the belief that people have natural rights that no government can justly take away, that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, that a people has the right to choose its own destiny. These ideas, born in the Enlightenment and nurtured in the unique circumstances of colonial America, found their moment in 1776 and changed the world.
But ideas alone do not win wars. It took Washington's steadfast leadership through years of defeat and disappointment. It took the courage of soldiers who endured unimaginable hardships for a cause they believed in. It took the diplomatic skill of Franklin in the courts of Europe. It took the willingness of France to risk its treasure and ultimately its stability to strike a blow against Britain. It took the support of ordinary Americans who fed armies, produced supplies, and kept faith with the cause, even when victory seemed impossibly distant. The alliance with France, celebrated that day at Valley Forge with volleys of musketry and shouts of "Long live the King of France," was a turning point. The war would continue for 3 more years. There would be victories and defeats, moments of hope and periods of despair. But after Saratoga proved that Americans could defeat British armies, and after France committed its power to the American cause, the ultimate outcome was no longer in serious doubt. Britain might win battles, but it could not win the war. In the end, American independence was won by a combination of military perseverance, diplomatic success, and the power of ideas whose time had come. The contradictions of the British system, with an aristocratic parliament claiming unlimited sovereignty, while the people increasingly demanded representation and rights, could not be sustained. The energy of the French Enlightenment, seeking to remake the world according to the principles of reason, found in America a laboratory for its experiments. And the American people themselves, with their tradition of local self-government, their Protestant emphasis on individual conscience, and their distance from the centers of European power, were uniquely positioned to create something new. That creation, the United States of America,
with all its flaws and contradictions, with its promise of liberty coexisting uneasily with the reality of slavery, with its bold declarations of equality struggling against entrenched inequality, would become the most powerful nation on earth and a beacon for people seeking freedom around the world. The seeds of all that were planted in these years, when Washington held his army together through Valley Forge, when Franklin negotiated in Paris, when soldiers froze and bled and died for a cause they believed in, and when Congress, speaking for a new people, declared to the world that America would be independent and free. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories of the pivotal moments that shaped our nation, make sure you're subscribed because we're just getting started. Hit that like button if you enjoyed learning about this crucial chapter in American history. Share this with someone who loves learning about the founding of our country. There are so many more untold stories from the American Revolution, stories of courage and sacrifice, of brilliant strategy and terrible mistakes, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. We'll be bringing you those stories, so subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single one. Thanks for watching, and remember, the freedoms we enjoy today were bought at a terrible price by men and women who believed in something greater than themselves.